The night before my wedding was supposed to be magical. Instead, it became the night I uncovered the truth. As I walked past the private lounge of the Grand Hotel, I heard my fiancé, Harrison Montgomery, laughing with his friends. What he said next shattered my world. "Come on, man, you can't be serious about settling down with Sophia," his best friend Blake scoffed. Harrison chuckled, his voice slightly slurred. "She's perfect on paper. Her trust fund will help expand Montgomery Enterprises, and her connections are invaluable. Besides, she's completely devoted to me." The laughter that followed was nothing compared to the knife he twisted with his next words. "She's just temporary anyway. Until someone better comes along." I stood frozen, clutching the small velvet box containing his grandfather's cufflinks. My heart pounded, my stomach twisted, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw the truth. The late-night business calls, the last-minute cancellations, the way he subtly manipulated my decisions, it all made sense now. But instead of breaking down, I found clarity. I walked out, my mind spinning, but my resolve strengthening. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. Instead, I opened my laptop. As Harrison's business partner, I had access to everything: emails, financial records, client information. 4 hours later, I had enough evidence to destroy not just his heart but his entire carefully constructed world. The morning of my wedding dawned with eerie serenity. My hands were steady as I applied my makeup, a stark contrast to the trembling excitement I had once imagined feeling on this day. Tucked safely in my dress was a cream-colored envelope containing every piece of damning evidence I had gathered. Diana, Harrison's mother, beamed as she fastened a delicate pearl necklace around my neck. "This has been in the Montgomery family for generations. Harrison's grandmother wore it on her wedding day. A family heirloom meant to symbolize love and legacy. Today, it would witness something entirely different." As I stood outside the church doors, I received the final message: additional evidence secured. Reporter in position. Business partners present. Police contact on standby. I deleted the message and turned toward the grand wooden doors. The music swelled. The guests rose. At the altar, Harrison stood tall and confident, oblivious to the storm that was about to consume him. His smile was practiced, perfect, just like the lie he had built around us. Step by step, I walked down the aisle, past the whispers of admiration, past the faces of those who believed in this illusion. 3 steps from the altar, I caught Blake's eye. His smirk faltered. Next to him, Rebecca Matthews, Harrison's business associate, and his mistress, adjusted her expensive navy dress, unaware that the very funds that had bought it were about to become public knowledge. 2 steps away. Diana dabbed her eyes. Claire, Harrison's sister, smiled radiantly, believing she was about to witness the happiest day of my life. 1 step away. "You look stunning," Harrison whispered, reaching for my hand. I stepped back. The priest opened his mouth to begin, but I turned to face the guests. My voice, steady as steel, echoed through the silent church. "Before we begin, I'd like to share some readings. Not from the Bible, but from Harrison's private emails to Rebecca Matthews. Dated throughout our engagement." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Harrison's face drained of color. I pulled out the first document. "My dearest Rebecca," I read aloud. "Once the wedding secures the merger and Sophia's trust fund is accessible, we can proceed with our original plan." "She suspects nothing." Gasps erupted. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Blake looked away. Harrison stepped forward, his voice desperate. "Sophia, please." I held up another document. "But wait, there's more. Would anyone like to hear about the offshore accounts? The diverted company funds? The emails to his mistress discussing their post-honeymoon plans?" I glanced at the entrance just as the church doors swung open. 2 suited agents stepped inside. "No," Harrison whispered in horror. The papers fluttered from my hands, scattering like poisonous snowflakes across the altar. Photographers hidden among the guests captured every moment. Gasps turned into murmurs, then into a storm of whispers. Harrison lunged toward me, but I stepped aside. "Talk? Like how you talked about me at your bachelor party. Temporary, wasn't I? Until someone better came along?" Blake sank into his seat. Rebecca covered her mouth. Diana clutched her pearls, her face ashen. Then, for the first time, Harrison fell to his knees. Not in love. Not in devotion. But in absolute devastation. I turned, walked down the aisle, and stepped into a new beginning. One where I wasn't someone's temporary choice. I was my own permanent masterpiece. "I trusted you." My voice echoed through the now silent church. "I loved you, Harrison, but to you, I was nothing more than a stepping stone, a means to an end." The guests, frozen in stunned silence, turned their eyes toward the altar. Diana stood abruptly, her face a mask of confusion and growing horror. "Harrison, what is she talking about?" "Mother, I can explain." "Explain the embezzlement?" I interrupted, my voice unwavering. "The affair? The planned merger that would have bankrupted dozens of families? Please, Harrison, explain to everyone exactly who you are." The SEC agents, who had been waiting in the shadows, began moving forward, flanking the altar. Rebecca had already slipped out a side door, but she wouldn't get far, another team was waiting outside. Harrison's charming facade shattered. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, he looked truly afraid. "You've ruined everything," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. I smiled, reaching up to remove the Montgomery family pearls from my neck. "No, Harrison. You did that all by yourself. I'm just making sure everyone knows exactly who they're dealing with." Chaos erupted. Guests gasped, some whispering frantically while others pulled out their phones to record. Claire was sobbing, her hands clutched over her mouth. Diana stood frozen in disbelief, her carefully curated world crumbling before her eyes. As the agents placed Harrison in handcuffs, he turned to me one last time. "I did love you," he muttered. "In my own way." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "Your way was never good enough. Consider this my wedding gift, the truth about the man you really are." I turned away, walking down the aisle alone. The sound of cameras clicking and murmurs growing behind me was a mere backdrop to the only thing that mattered: freedom. the spring sunlight greeted me as I pushed open the church doors, where a crowd of reporters had already gathered. Their questions rained down like bullets, but I merely smiled. This wasn't the fairy tale ending I had once imagined. It was better. It was justice. The following weeks unfolded like scenes from a movie I never thought I'd star in. Headlines screamed, "Montgomery Empire crumbles, jilted bride exposes corporate corruption." My phone buzzed nonstop, well-wishers, journalists, even former Montgomery employees reaching out in gratitude. I sat in my new apartment overlooking Central Park, a place Harrison had once dismissed as new money territory. The irony wasn't lost on me. My laptop screen displayed the latest news. Harrison and Rebecca had been indicted on multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement. The evidence I had gathered had cracked open a Pandora's box of corporate misconduct. Claire called daily, her voice torn between anger and devastation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked one night, voice trembling. I could have helped. But we both knew she couldn't have. Her blind spot for her brother had always been her greatest weakness. The most surprising visitor came 3 days after the wedding. Diana appeared at my door, carrying a familiar velvet box. "The pearls," she said, holding them out. "They belong to you now." I shook my head. "Diana, I couldn't." "You exposed the truth," she interrupted. Her voice, though firm, was tinged with grief. "That makes you more worthy of these than anyone who has ever worn them before." We sat on my new sofa, drinking tea from cups I had bought that very morning. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words. "I failed him," she finally whispered, staring into her untouched cup. "Somewhere along the way, I must have." "No," I said, taking her hand. "Harrison made his own choices. You gave him everything he needed to be a good man. He chose differently." Montgomery Enterprises collapsed under the weight of its corruption. Harrison's father had laid the foundation for deceit, and Harrison had perfected it. Hundreds of employees suffered, but I had prepared for that. My anonymous tips had helped many of them transfer their investments before the scandal broke. Blake tried to contact me once, probably hoping to save his own skin. His message sat unread in my inbox, right alongside Harrison's desperate attempts at an explanation. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Rebecca turned state's evidence, of course. She had always been practical like that. Her testimony ensured Harrison would spend a significant portion of his prime years in a federal prison, trading his bespoke suits for prison garb. The media painted me as a hero, the whistleblower bride. They didn't understand that, for me, it was never a choice. The moment I overheard Harrison's true intentions, my path became crystal clear. Love without respect is like a house built on sand. It is bound to collapse. My own company flourished in the aftermath. Clients sought me out, valuing my integrity. Harrison's attempt to use me had backfired spectacularly, launching me into a success greater than he had ever imagined. 1 month after the wedding that wasn't, I received a letter from Harrison's grandmother. Her shaky handwriting filled 3 pages with memories of her own marriage, of watching Harrison grow up, and, finally, her gratitude. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," she wrote. "You saw the truth and refused to look away. The letter ended with a photograph of Harrison's grandfather on his own wedding day, young and hopeful. The same hope I had once seen in Harrison's eyes before greed and deception twisted it into something unrecognizable. I kept the photo. Not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder, appearances can be deceiving. As summer faded into autumn, I often walked through Central Park. The changing leaves mirrored my own transformation, painful but necessary. Diana joined me on these walks sometimes. We rarely spoke of Harrison, but his absence lingered like an unspoken bond between us. One day, she squeezed my hand and said, "You know, I always wanted a daughter who would carry on the Montgomery legacy of strength and integrity. Turns out, I got one. Just, not in the way I expected." Her words settled in my heart. In trying to destroy me, Harrison had inadvertently given me something far more valuable, a family bound not by blood, but by truth and resilience. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, I stood in front of Montgomery Enterprises' former headquarters. The name had changed, the leadership had changed, and inside, a new culture of integrity thrived. I had been invited to consult on the company's restructuring. Harrison's old office had been transformed into a communal workspace, its heavy mahogany doors replaced with glass panels. Sunlight streamed in where shadows once lurked. A fitting metaphor for the transformation. Justice had arrived, and I had been its messenger. And as I walked through the corridors of the company Harrison had tried to weaponize against me, I smiled. This was the best revenge, not destruction, but reconstruction. Building something better from the ashes of deception. I saw him clearly for who he was, a man whose greatest defeat was being exposed for his true nature. The evidence was overwhelming. Each document I had gathered that fateful night before the wedding became another nail in the coffin of his defense. His lawyers attempted to paint me as a vengeful woman scorned, but the paper trail told a different story, one of calculated fraud spanning years. The most poignant moment came when Diana testified. She sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her elegant composure intact as she detailed how her own son had manipulated family funds and betrayed generations of trust. The truth, she stated clearly, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, must stand above blood. Harrison's face crumpled at her words. For the first time, I saw genuine emotion break through his practiced mask, the realization that he had lost not just his freedom, but his mother's unwavering support. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Each day brought new revelations, more evidence of how deep the corruption had run. Former employees testified about threats and coercion. Business partners revealed how they had been drawn into Harrison's web of deceit. Through it all, I sat in the gallery beside Claire, watching the man we had both loved reveal his darkest colors to the world. The verdict came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 15 years with no possibility of early parole. As the judge read out the terms, I studied Harrison's profile, still handsome, but somehow diminished. The charming smile that had once won over boardrooms, and my heart was nowhere to be seen. Rebecca, having pleaded to lesser charges in exchange for her testimony, received 5 years. She avoided my gaze as she was led away, her designer outfit replaced by prison orange. Blake, charged as an accessory, accepted a plea deal that included community service and hefty fines. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Diana stepped forward, Claire and I flanking her sides. "The Montgomery family," she announced, her voice steady, "has always valued integrity above all else. Today's verdict, while painful, upholds that tradition. We thank the jury for their service and justice for prevailing." Later that evening, we gathered at Diana's townhouse, not to mourn, but to close a chapter. Claire brought out a bottle of champagne, the same vintage we had planned to serve at the wedding. "To truth," she toasted, her eyes meeting mine, "and to the sister I almost had, who turned out to be more family than my own brother." Diana reached for my hand as we sipped our champagne. "You know," she mused, "I've been thinking about what you said that day at the altar, about love and truth. You chose truth over love, but in doing so, you showed the greatest love of all, love for justice, for what's right." The evening softened into night, our conversation turning from the past to the future. Claire spoke of her plans to rebrand the remaining legitimate Montgomery businesses. Diana shared her vision for a foundation supporting corporate ethics. As I drove home that night, the city skyline glittered against the dark sky. The weight I had carried since the night before my wedding finally began to lift. Harrison's sentencing wasn't just an ending, it was permission to truly begin again. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A photo appeared, Harrison in his prison uniform, being led to his cell. Below it, a message from a sympathetic guard, "Thought you'd want to see this. Justice served." I deleted the message without responding. I didn't need to see Harrison brought low, I had already seen him at his highest and found him wanting. My revenge wasn't in his imprisonment, but in the freedom I had found by exposing the truth. The wedding dress that had hung in my closet like a ghost was finally packed away, donated to a charity that helped domestic abuse survivors rebuild their lives. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. What was meant to be a symbol of love and trust would now help other women write their own stories of redemption. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the girl who had once dreamed of becoming Mrs. Montgomery. She had been naive, perhaps, but her belief in justice had been her saving grace. Harrison had seen her trust as weakness, never realizing it would be his undoing. A year after Harrison's sentencing, I found myself back at the Grand Hotel, not as a bride-to-be, but as the keynote speaker for a corporate ethics conference. The irony of speaking in the same building where I had overheard Harrison's true nature wasn't lost on me. The ballroom was packed with executives, all eager to hear from the woman who had exposed one of the biggest corporate scandals of the decade. As I stepped onto the stage, my heels clicking against the polished wood, I caught my reflection in the glass panels, confident, poised, and completely transformed from the woman I had been a year ago. "Good morning," I began, surveying the crowd. "You're here today because you want to learn how to prevent fraud and corruption in your organizations. But what you really need to learn is how to see the truth hiding behind perfect smiles and designer suits." In the front row, Diana and Claire sat proudly. Claire had successfully rebranded the remaining Montgomery assets into a new company focused on sustainable investments. Diana's foundation had already sponsored ethics programs at 3 major universities. The greatest threat to corporate integrity isn't always external, I continued. Sometimes, it's the charming CEO with a Harvard degree. Sometimes it's the trusted partner with a flawless track record. And sometimes it's the person you plan to spend your life with. My consulting firm had grown exponentially, with offices now in New York, London, and Singapore. Companies worldwide sought our expertise in fraud prevention and corporate transparency. Each new client brought with them stories of near misses and close calls, potential Harrison Montgomerys caught before they could cause irreparable damage. After my speech, during the networking reception, a young woman approached me. Her hands trembled slightly as she introduced herself. "I'm engaged to my company's CFO," she confided, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last week, I found some discrepancies in our books. After hearing your story, I don't know what to do." I looked at her, seeing my former self reflected in her uncertain eyes. "The truth doesn't get easier to tell," I said gently, "but living with lies becomes impossible once you see them." By the end of the day, another corporate fraud had been prevented. Another scandal averted. Another woman had chosen truth over illusion. As I watched the sun set over Central Park from my office, I realized that my greatest victory wasn't in bringing Harrison to justice. It was in proving to myself that I had always been strong enough to walk away. And that sometimes, the greatest love story isn't about finding the right partner. It's about finding the strength to stand alone for what's right. I watched the prison disappear in the side mirror. Harrison would serve another 13 years, but I was already free from the weight of what-ifs and might-have-beens, free from the ghost of a love that was more fiction than fact. The sky had cleared, and ahead of us, a rainbow arched across the horizon, a quiet promise that after every storm, something beautiful could emerge. My phone buzzed with a message from Claire. The Foundation's latest initiative had received full funding. Life had a funny way of working out. I had lost a fiancé but gained a family, lost a dream but found a purpose. The night before my wedding had seemed like an ending, but it had really been a beginning, the start of a journey towards something far more precious than the fairy tale I had almost settled for. The truth, it turned out, hadn't just set me free, it had set us all free. 1 year after my meeting with Harrison, my life had blossomed in ways I never imagined possible. The Ethics Foundation had expanded globally, and our consulting firm had become the gold standard in corporate transparency. But it was a different kind of meeting that would define this new chapter of my story. I was giving a lecture at Columbia Business School when I noticed him in the audience, dark eyes fixed intently on my presentation, asking thoughtful questions about preventive measures against corporate fraud. Professor Marcus Chin, a visiting faculty member from Stanford, specialized in business ethics and corporate responsibility. After the lecture, he approached me with an intriguing proposition. "Miss Grant, your experience could revolutionize how we teach ethics in business schools. Would you consider collaborating on a comprehensive curriculum?" There was something refreshingly genuine about him, no hidden agendas, no carefully crafted persona, just an authentic passion for creating positive change. Diana noticed it first during a foundation board meeting where Marcus presented his ideas. "He looks at you the way one should look at someone they admire," she remarked afterward. "Not as a prize to be won, but as an equal to be respected." Our professional collaboration slowly evolved into coffee discussions that stretched into dinner conversations. Marcus never pushed, never rushed. He understood the weight of my past and respected the strength it had given me. Claire teased me mercilessly about the way my eyes lit up when discussing our curriculum project. You know, Sophia, it's okay to be happy again. To trust again. But trust wasn't something I gave easily anymore. One evening, over dinner at a quiet restaurant in Greenwich Village, I told Marcus everything, not just the headlines he'd read, but the raw truth of loving someone who had seen me as nothing more than a means to an end. His response was simple but profound. Thank you for trusting me with your story. It couldn't have been easy to share. Months passed, and our curriculum project flourished. Business schools across the country began adopting our ethics program. Marcus and I spent countless hours refining case studies, including the Montgomery scandal, now taught as a landmark example of corporate fraud detection. One rainy evening, as we walked through Central Park after a successful presentation, Marcus stopped under the shelter of a massive oak tree. You know what amazes me about you, Sophia, he said, raindrops glistening in his hair. Not just your strength in exposing the truth, but your courage to remain open to possibility, even after everything. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what Diana had noticed months ago. Here was a man who had built his career on teaching ethics, not because it was profitable, but because he believed in it. Someone who saw my past not as baggage, but as wisdom earned. The truth is, he continued, I've fallen in love with you. Not the headline version of you, but the real you, brilliant, compassionate, and unafraid to stand for what's right. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to show you that love can be honest, straightforward, and true. Standing there in the rain, I felt something I thought I had lost forever, hope. Not the naive hope of my younger self, but something stronger, tempered by experience and wisdom. Claire and Diana were ecstatic when I finally admitted I was dating again. Life has a way of bringing us exactly what we need, Diana said, squeezing my hand. Sometimes it's the courage to expose a lie. Sometimes it's the strength to embrace a truth. The Foundation's annual gala provided the perfect opportunity to make our relationship public. As Marcus and I danced under the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Hotel, yes, the same one where I had overheard Harrison's betrayal, I realized how far I had come. You're thinking about that night, aren't you? Marcus asked softly. Yes, I admitted. But not with regret. That night taught me to trust my instincts, to demand truth in love. It led me here. He smiled, understanding in his eyes. To quote your famous speech, the truth doesn't always give you the ending you wanted, but it always leads you to the one you need. As we swayed to the music, I caught Diana's knowing smile from across the room. She raised her glass in a subtle toast, and I knew she was thinking what I was. Sometimes the best revenge isn't in destroying what hurt you, but in building something beautiful from the lessons it taught you. The truth that had shattered my world 2 years ago had led me to a love that didn't need to be tested or proved, a love as transparent and steady as the principles we both lived by. 3 years to the day after my almost wedding to Harrison, I stood in front of my full-length mirror, adjusting a different white dress. This one was simpler, more elegant, a reflection of the woman I had become. Diana fussed with my veil, her eyes glistening with genuine happiness. This time, she whispered, everything is exactly as it should be. Claire burst into the room, champagne in hand. Marcus is practically floating out there. And you should see the students who showed up. Half of Columbia's business school came to watch their favorite professors tie the knot. The venue wasn't a grand cathedral like my first planned wedding. Instead, we chose the botanical gardens, where Marcus and I had spent countless hours discussing our curriculum, between stolen kisses and shared dreams. The guest list was smaller, but every person present represented a genuine connection, a true relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. "Ready?" Diana asked, holding out a familiar velvet box. The Montgomery pearls gleamed in the morning light. Once a symbol of a dynasty built on deception, they now represented something different, the power of transformation, of turning pain into purpose. I smiled, closing the box gently. "I think these belong to the foundation now, a reminder of where we've been and how far we've come." Diana's eyes welled with tears as she hugged me. "You truly are the daughter of your own story." The ceremony was everything my first one wasn't: authentic, intimate, and filled with genuine joy. Marcus's vows weren't about ownership or obligation, but about partnership and shared purpose. When he spoke of how my journey had inspired him long before we met, how my courage had made him a better educator and person, I saw the same conviction in his eyes that I had first noticed years ago. "My love," I said, looking into his steady gaze, "love isn't about perfect moments or grand gestures. It's about choosing truth over comfort, growth over complacency, and finding someone who makes those choices with you every single day." The reception buzzed with energy, students mingling with business leaders, all united by a commitment to ethical leadership. The Foundation's newest initiative, a scholarship program for whistleblowers seeking to rebuild their careers, had just launched, turning another page in our shared story of transformation. Claire clinked her glass, drawing everyone's attention. Her smile was radiant. "To my sister, not by blood, but by choice, who taught us that the greatest love story isn't about finding the right person but about becoming the right person." And to Marcus, who proved that true love doesn't ask you to compromise your values, it elevates them. Later, as Marcus and I swayed to our first dance, he whispered, "Do you ever think about how different life would have been if you hadn't overheard Harrison that night?" I glanced around the room, the family I had found, the purpose I had embraced, the man who loved me not despite my past, but because of how it had shaped me. "That night didn't change my destiny," I said softly. "It revealed it." News had reached us that Harrison was up for parole review, but it felt distant, like a chapter in someone else's story. His actions had set my transformation in motion, but they no longer defined me. The woman who had walked away from a false dream had found something real, a love built on truth, a purpose born of principle, and a happiness earned through courage. As the evening wound down, Diana pulled me aside, pressing a small package into my hands. "This belonged to Harrison's grandmother," she said. Inside was a simple journal from her early days as a Montgomery. She wrote about choosing truth over convenience, even when it costs you everything, Diana explained. "You're not just continuing her legacy, you've reinvented it." Looking across the garden, where Marcus was deep in conversation with our guests, I felt an overwhelming sense of completion. The revenge I had once sought had transformed into something far more powerful: redemption. Not just for myself, but for everyone touched by our story. 5 years after that fateful night, I stood before a packed auditorium at Stanford Business School, facing the next generation of business leaders. Marcus sat in the front row, now the head of the ethics department, beaming with pride. 2 rows behind him sat Diana and Claire, who never missed these annual lectures. But this year was different. This would be the last time I told this story. You know the headlines, I began, my voice steady. The jilted bride who exposed a corporate scandal. The woman who walked away from a Montgomery. But today, I want to talk about something more important than revenge or justice. I want to talk about transformation. A student raised her hand. Miss Chin, what made you decide to stop giving these lectures? I smiled, resting a hand instinctively on my slightly rounded belly, our first child, still our secret. Because some stories need to end so new ones can begin. After the lecture, Claire perched on the edge of my desk, like she used to in our consulting days. Harrison's up for parole next month, she said quietly. He asked if we would speak on his behalf. Time had softened even the sharpest edges of betrayal. Will you? I asked. I might, she admitted. He's different now. The letters he writes, they aren't from the brother I knew. They're from the brother I wished I had. Diana had visited him regularly over the years, watching him slowly shed the layers of deception. He had started counseling other inmates, helping them understand the ripple effects of white-collar crime. The foundation had evolved, too, from a response to corporate fraud into a global movement for ethical business practices. That evening, Marcus found me in our home office. You're thinking about Harrison's parole, aren't you? I nodded. I'm thinking about how far we've all come. How that night before my wedding wasn't an ending at all, it was a beginning. The next morning, I wrote a letter to the parole board, not to condemn or support, but to acknowledge change. The man I was going to marry chose deception over truth, I wrote. The man you're considering for parole has chosen to face that truth. In the end, that's all any of us can do, choose truth again and again, no matter the cost. 6 years after that night, I received an invitation that made my hands tremble. Harrison had been released, and Diana was hosting a small family dinner. He wanted to make amends. Marcus and I arrived with our daughter, Grace, peacefully asleep in her car seat. Claire met us at the door. He's different, she whispered. Really different. Inside, Harrison stood as we entered. Prison had aged him, stripped away the polished veneer he once wore like armor. His designer suits were gone, replaced with modest clothing, but it was his eyes that showed the most change, clear, direct, no longer calculating. Mrs. Chin, he said softly. Thank you for coming. Over dinner, he spoke about his work in prison, teaching ethics and connecting with victims' families. The Foundation's curriculum became part of our rehabilitation program, he admitted. I taught it to other inmates, never telling them the case study was my own. Later, he pulled out a worn piece of paper. Dear Sophia, he read, his voice humble. Thank you. Not for what you stopped me from doing, but for what you helped me become. Grace chose that moment to wake, her small cry cutting through the tension. I lifted her into my arms, and she settled against my shoulder, watching curiously. Harrison's gaze softened, "She's beautiful," he said. "She has your determination in her eyes." Walking out into the cool evening air, I felt lighter. Marcus carried our sleeping daughter, and I lingered on Diana's steps, looking up at the stars. "You know," Diana said beside me, "when you exposed Harrison's truth, I thought our family was destroyed. Instead, you gave us all a chance at something real." The night before my wedding had revealed an ugly truth, but from those shattered pieces, we had built something beautiful. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't in watching someone fall, it's in helping others rise. The truth that had once broken my heart had, in the end, healed us all.